So, many of you may be experiencing similar feelings that I'm experiencing this week right before Pesach, and that is this free-floating anxiety about the upcoming holiday. This is so true. I'll tell you a quick anecdote, and that is I was at the gym this week, and there's a woman who often is working out the same time as I am. She's a member of the Immaculate Conception Church. You may or may not know I do some interfaith work with Father Ashmond over there, and every year I run a Seder for them. And she's always at that Seder, and so we have become friendly over the years. And she mentioned to me that because Pesach and Easter are falling out at a similar time, she said to me that she's experiencing some of the same anxiety that Jews feel at this time of year because Easter is coming, to which I giggled. But it's true that holidays do bring anxiety. And they bring anxiety for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk about it in just a few moments. But even writing this sermon made me begin to sweat. Somehow, as soon as there is the announcement of Purim, I begin to start thinking about Pesach. It's similar, of course, to the announcement of the month of Elul as I begin to prepare for the high holidays. So I'm going to tell you right this from the outset, and that is that this sermon is filled with more platitudes and more cliches than you can probably bear, and probably more than I usually give. But I'm hoping that in some way the words I offer this morning, the approach that I'm going to suggest, will in fact alleviate some of the stress. There are all sorts of little tricks we can play with our own selves as we go to sleep at night in order to allow our minds to calm down. The one that has worked most for me in the past few weeks has been just simply trying to list various objects that I have in my house. It trains my mind not to think about all of the pressures and anxiety that I might be feeling. And so, while that is a good approach, I want to offer 4 separate meditations that people can find, hopefully, to be somewhat helpful in relieving the constant and exhaustive pressure that we can feel at this time of year. Between the pressures of the holidays and the pressures that COVID has brought, and the pressures of the concern about the people in the Ukraine, of not knowing whether we should be masking or not masking, whether your children have been approved yet for a vaccine if they're of age or not, whether you have been quadruple boosted or you have suffered from some immunocompromised position. These pressures are overwhelming. And for people who are less grounded, this can create a free-floating anxiety that we all have a hard time pinpointing. And then, of course, there's Pesach. Family is coming, or we're going to family. Travel in and of itself is nerve-wracking, but having people in our homes can be even more tumultuous. I mentioned to the kids downstairs just a minute ago that this year, thank God, we're going to be having most of my children and a couple babies, a couple significant others, and 3 more dogs. To which I am looking forward to having an extremely large house when they leave. That was a reference to that story about bringing in all of the varied animals. And we all are working hard to make sure this holiday is as perfect as it can be. all of us, or at least many of us, are saying that maybe this year I'm going to cut a few corners. Maybe instead of making gefilte fish from scratch, there will be those who just buy it from a jar this year. Nuh-uh. Maybe instead of making every side dish, maybe we'll just buy a few side dishes this year. And truthfully, no one would blame you. But of course, then there is the cost of what this holiday brings for so many who take seriously the requirements to kosher your house and to only have kosher Pesach items in your house. And for some of us, it does actually feel like price gouging. I see you're all relating. And for those of you who weren't anxious before, I'm sure you are now. And then, of course, there are all the personal issues that people are facing, whether it is a sister who's in crisis because of a personal health issue, or because people are having problems with their careers, or they're struggling with their elderly parents, or their marriage is on the rocks, or their kids are struggling. There's so much that can lead a person to break. And then there is our imaginations. We all can imagine things to be much worse, and we imagine how terrible things are going to be. So here's my first cliche for this morning. Anticipation is worse always than the actual experience. Not necessarily are things going to always be the way we think they're going to be. Number 2 cliche is don't believe everything you think. And then, of course, another version of that is my cliche number 3 for this morning, and that is anxiety lies to you. The solution to all of this, I tell you, is one simple TikTok video that I saw in which a woman says, I reject that. That's how she makes herself feel better. No matter what she's thinking, she says, I reject that idea. Whenever a negative thought comes into our head, all you have to do, says this TikToker, is say, I reject that. It reminds me of a time I went to a therapist who I went to because I was feeling very angry. And I said, I need some way to release this anger. She said, just don't be angry. It's like the worst thing you can possibly say to somebody in the world is calm down. It only makes people more frustrated. So, I never tell a person who comes to me and says, I know I'm a type A person, but I want to be more relaxed. I never say to them, so just be. You hear the joke? Just be. Forget it. But all joking aside, I do believe that our tradition has a way of changing the way we think. We call it prayer. We can convince ourselves of things if we say them over and over again. If we say things often enough and on a schedule, you can get yourself to believe anything. So in a few weeks, I'm going to be giving a workshop about what happens after you die. Life after death. And I am going to tell the group at that time that I'm not an expert and I have never died. And I've never met a person who died and came back after being significantly dead. That always reminds me of that line from Princess Bride. He's almost dead, not completely dead. But this idea that a person has gone and come back and then can report on the experience, I find implausible. But I'm going to spend an hour talking about the possibilities. But I digress. I do believe that with just a few meditations suggested by our sacred calendar before we go to sleep or while we're experiencing anxiety during the day, we have a shot at being more happy, being more joyful, being able to enjoy the experiences that we're going to have if we just take a few minutes to imagine the best and not the worst. Then we can leave some room that things won't be so bad. In trying to imagine the upcoming holiday and how I want to enjoy it, here are the 4 things that this calendar of ours has taught me. One is, what are the memories that I have that are serving me in a positive way? 2, what are the sacrifices that I'm making? What is my contribution going to be? And how do I really want to spend the time while we're all together? They help me to create a plan for changing my expectations while getting myself into the most positive mindset I can. So while you're here, you can try it with me. And then over the next few days, you might want to try laying in bed and thinking about these 4 things, or maybe only focus on one. Instead of thinking about, did I get enough eggs? Where is everybody going to sleep? Is the brisket large enough? What can I do when my Aunt Barbara brings up the stolen election? So instead of perseverating on those, we'll try these 4 instead. Prior to Passover, you know that there are 4 special Shabbatot. They're supposed to, I believe, get us ready for Pesach, but I've long wondered how. So let me suggest, each of the Shabbatot prior to Pesach asks us to think about a different aspect of the holiday. Ideally, we would have started prep for Pesach weeks and weeks ago, but let's try it this week instead. The first special Shabbat is Shabbat Shkalim. It's this week that we focus on the half shekel that each Jew brought in order to upkeep the tabernacle. The byproduct was a way of taking a census. It asks the fundamental question of every Jew: what is your contribution going to be? How are you going to add to this corporate project? The underlying understanding of the half shekel is that everyone can afford a half shekel and that together we make up a whole. Says Parshat Shkalim, as we prepare for Passover, we have to ask ourselves the question, what is our contribution going to be? And then realize that you don't have to do everything yourself. What are you going to bring to the experience? Is it only food, a special dish that you received the recipe for from a mom or a grandmother? Special way of making charoset that makes it special and full of love? Or can you bring an attitude, an insight, a comfort? So I ask you, as you drift off to sleep, either right now during my sermon or before you go to sleep, ask yourself the question, so what is my special gift that I bring? Is it a sense of humor, or is it a much-needed listening ear? Is it a non-judgmental experience, or are we going to fall prey to being filled with accusations? Maybe I can bring to the Seder a good question that will spur conversation, or maybe just a melody that will change an attitude. The second special parsha is Parshat Zachor, which reminds us there are people who sought our destruction. In the most ruthless way, they wanted us dead. There's no question that that same butchery exists today, and that we must, at our Siddharim, bring readings about the Ukraine. If that is true of us as a nation, then it's equally true of us sitting here today and those who will be at our Siddharim. So let's use this moment to make some choices and ask ourselves the question, which of our memories are serving us well? Each of us can recall times in our lives when nightmares, and maybe even some of them happened on Pesach. Maybe the interminable seders that went on until 1 a.m. Maybe we felt humiliated by being asked questions that we had no idea what the answers to, or being forced to recite the 4 questions before we were capable of doing them, or long after somebody else should have taken them over. Maybe we have memories that were far worse, of loved ones who passed away right before or during Pesach, or the terrible fights that maybe family members got into around the table over issues that had been festering for months that had nothing to do with politics. And ask yourself the question, if those memories are serving you well, or are they the source of so much of the anxiety going into Pesach that something like that is going to happen again, or that simply you can't think of anything else? Are those memories bringing you down? Are they robbing you of energy and creativity? So I ask you to replace them with better memories. For a minute, think about maybe your first Passover that you can recall. Maybe think of the food or the laughter. Think of the spills and the stained HaGadol. Think about the hugs and the kisses. Think of the sweet flavors and maybe the wonderful smells and some surprises. Then the next is Parshat Parah. This is the reading of the red heifer that was brought as a sacrifice. It's supposed to remind us, I believe, of the sacrifices that were offered on this holiday. We might immediately associate with the Paschal sacrifice. We might even think of the story of putting blood on the doorposts so the angel of death might pass over us and spare us. Like all events in our lives, they are associative. We put stories together in categories. We put all of our deaths together. We rate happy occasions against other happy occasions. We lump together all of our challenges. Specifically, the red heifer was brought to purify a person who came into contact with the dead. And there is no doubt that each and every one of us have had losses, and we feel that there is an empty chair at our table. At a bris, you know that we leave a chair empty for Elijah. On Pesach, we only have a cup for Elijah, no empty chair. And so I ask, why? As one of our Hebrew school students said, because he has so many places to visit, he doesn't have time to sit. To which I said, maybe we made up Santa. And then I wondered, though, in reality, what it would feel like if we had an empty chair at the table. We know how crowded our table can be already. But we also know that we would, in a heartbeat, make room for one more person who wasn't able to be there or who is no longer with us, not who is missing, and how we feel it, whether it's Zadie or Mom or Sis or Junior. Today I ask, what are the sacrifices that you have made to get to this moment? What are the hours of preparation and giving and thoughtfulness that you have put into this moment? How have we sacrificed so much of our time to get ready to be at Passover? Have we sacrificed going to work? Have we sacrificed physical, material resources? And then, more importantly, and to this we must ask ourselves the question, is it worth it? If not, why are we doing it? If yes, how do we make those sacrifices meaningful and not wasted? Finally, I say don't sacrifice your joy by covering it over with resentment. Own your sacrifices, but own them selflessly. with no need for acknowledgement or praise, even if you thought it'd be nice. I say, give at this time altruistically, because isn't your family worth it? Finally, Parshat HaChodesh, which we read last week, reminds us that the month of Nisan is the time in which Passover is celebrated. Based on our intercalculation of the calendar, it comes around the same time every year. It doesn't ever creep up on us. It shouldn't ever take us by surprise. It's supposed to be in the spring, and therefore every year it comes in the spring. Societies earlier, sometimes we say they came early, sometimes we say they came late, but either way, it was never by accident. Yet, in its core, Chodesh really comes from the same word as Chadash, which means new, and leaves us with really two great meditations on which to conclude. One is what is going to be new at this Seder. Maybe who will be new at our Seder? Or how will this Seder be new? And then number two, and maybe more importantly, Chodesh is about how we measure time, how we measure days and weeks and years. So number two is, how do we want to be spending our time? Do you want to be in the kitchen, prepping and serving and cleaning? Or can all of that just wait? Maybe even others could help doing that. Wouldn't you rather be spending your time laughing and learning and growing and connecting? Says this last meditation, ask yourself, how do I want to be spending my time? And then make it happen. When I was younger, we used to go to visit Tante Dorothy. May her memory remain for a blessing in Hartford, Connecticut. I'll be honest, I never really liked visiting her for all of the typical reasons a 10-year-old boy doesn't like visiting their 80-year-old aunt from the old country. But let me just list a few for you. The first was that the drive was really long. I don't think it really was in actuality, it just felt long in those years. Number two was her kisses were wet and disgusting. Number three was I didn't like the way she pulled me into her bosom. Number four was her house smelled funny. Number five was there was nothing to do there. But there was a candy dish. It was green, it had little glass bubble balls on the cover, and when you opened it, it was filled with raisinets. So that's what I chose to focus on. Laying in the back of the station wagon with the seats folded down so that my brothers and I could play whatever games we wanted to without seat belts, with a back window that was open so the exhaust could come right in, I would stare out the window and think of the candy dish and the raisinets and see how many I could get into my mouth before my parents cut me off. So at very least, I had something to look forward to instead of all of the things that I thought bothered me. Terribly missed Tante Dorothy. Married to Uncle Fievel. They were good people. I wish I had focused more on them, but that's a 10-year-old. So I say to you right now, if these meditations don't work, if you try them and they just don't work, at least think about the jelly rolls and the chocolate-covered marshmallows and the caramel clusters which is our way of trying to distract ourselves from all of the challenges. So, let me be one of the first to say, Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Have a happy and a healthy and a kosher Pesach. Shabbat Shalom.